Wallace and Barry at the fair. Wallace and Barry are best friends. They love to build forts, jump off of swings, climb trees, and collect insects. They've been friends forever. The only problem is that they always seem to get into some kind of mischief. Wallace's mother was not very happy when they decided to make mud pies in her kitchen, and Barry's father was not very excited when they attempted to reshape the hedges in the front yard to look like zoo animals. Barry and Wallace could never figure out why their great ideas always ended up getting them into trouble. One day, Barry and Wallace asked if they could go to the fair for the afternoon. Their parents reluctantly agreed, but only if they were both back home by dinner time. "Oh, we'll be back before then," exclaimed Barry. Their parents waved goodbye to them as they walked down the street toward the fair. They were so excited because they'd never been to the fair before. They couldn't wait to play games, see the animals, and eat delicious treats. Just as Barry and Wallace were walking into the fair, they were stopped by a man selling balloons. Wallace just loved balloons. He loved the way they tugged at the string in your hand, the way they smelled, and all of the wonderful colors that they came in. Wallace decided that he wanted to have a balloon of every color. He convinced Barry to chip in, and they asked for 6 balloons. One by one, the man untied the balloons and handed them to Wallace. Wallace could feel the balloons tugging at his arm and trying to escape, but he held them tight. Just as the man handed Wallace the 6th balloon, a huge gust of wind came up. The wind was so powerful that it swept Wallace up into the air. He was flying. He looked down over the fair. The wind kept blowing, and Wallace was starting to drift away from the fair. He was up high above the trees. On the ground, Barry was shouting for Wallace to come back, but he knew Wallace could not hear him. As Wallace began his airborne adventure, Barry took off down the road, following his every move. Wallace was gliding over the meadow. Barry was running across it. Wallace flew over the stream. Barry jumped over it. They were moving further and further away from the fair and from their houses. Barry was starting to get worried because they were headed straight for the forest. He hoped that Wallace would get stuck on a tree, or else he knew he would have to go through the deep, dark forest all by himself. Sure enough, Wallace was so high in the air that his feet just grazed the top of the trees. Barry stopped right at the edge of the woods and took a deep breath. He'd never be able to find Wallace if he didn't keep going, so he stepped into the woods. Barry devised a plan. He would run ahead of Wallace, collect some pebbles, and climb to the top of a tree to wait for him. Barry thought he could bring Wallace down by carefully popping the balloons, one at a time. Barry found pebbles and scaled a tall tree. He knew he would only have a short window of time to carry out his plan. He could see Wallace and the balloons fast approaching. He held his breath, squinted, and tossed the first pebble. Whoosh! Pop! And then the orange balloon. Whoosh! Pop! And then the yellow balloon. Whoosh! Pop! The green one, the blue one. Wallace came floating down into the top of the tree. "You saved me! You saved me!" he shouted. Now that Wallace was safe, they climbed down from the trees and started their long walk home. "What an adventure! I sure have worked up an appetite," said Wallace. "I hope we're having meatballs for dinner." They both giggled and walked off into the setting sun. The end.